Somewhere, on a quiet field at the end of the day, there is a ball. Just an old leather ball, scuffed and soft at the seams, resting in the grass while the light goes gold and then gray. No one is kicking it now. It simply waits, the way old things wait, holding a little of the warmth it gathered through the afternoon. Tonight, we are going to follow that ball. We are going to let it roll, slowly, across almost 100 years, across oceans and stadiums and small muddy fields in factory towns, through the story of one country and the strange, beautiful game it never quite knew what to do with. The United States and the World Cup, a love that came late and left and came back again. You will meet a hearse driver who became a hero for an afternoon, a team that sailed to the bottom of the world and stunned everyone, including themselves. A goal so unlikely that newspaper editors an ocean away assumed it was a mistake. And you will meet the quiet years in between, the long silence, and the slow, patient way the game grew back. There is no need to remember any of it. That is not why we are here. These stories happened long ago and far away, and they ask nothing of you but your company. Let the names drift past like towns seen from a train window at night. If you enjoy stories like these, and you would like more of them to find you on quiet evenings, you are always welcome to stay a while and follow along, but only if it feels easy. Nothing here needs effort. So settle in, let your shoulders drop. Somewhere out there, a referee's whistle is fading into the dusk, the last sound of a long day of play, and the ball is beginning, very gently, to roll. Part 1, The First Journey, Shorty said. Long before there were bright screens and roaring crowds, there was a ship. In the summer of 1930, a group of American men boarded an ocean liner in New York Harbor and pointed themselves toward the far side of the world. They were sailing to Uruguay, to a country most of them had never seen, to play in the very first World Cup. The ball had barely begun to roll, and already it was crossing an entire ocean. On the deck in the salt wind, some of them trained by jogging in circles and heading a ball back and forth, laughing at how strange it all was. Below deck, they slept to the hum of the engines. None of them could have known that what they were about to do would still be talked about a century later. They were not famous. They were not favorites. They were simply going because someone had asked, and because the game was worth the journey. And somewhere in that crossing, the story we are following quietly began. These men were not conjured from nowhere. Most of them came from a real and thriving world of American soccer that has since been almost forgotten. In the 1920s, mill towns and industrial cities across the Northeast had their own professional league, the American Soccer League, and on Saturdays the grandstands filled with workers who came to watch. The players on that ship had names stitched to places like Fall River and New Bedford and Providence and St. Louis. They worked in factories and carried the game home in their boots at the end of a shift. To them, soccer was not exotic. It was a Saturday afternoon, a patch of grass, the smell of cut turf and coal smoke. When we picture that first American team, we should not picture strangers to the sport. We should picture ordinary working men who happened to be very good at something their country would soon forget it ever loved. Their captain was a quiet forward named Tom Flory from the whaling town of New Bedford, and around him stood a lineup that would not change for the entire tournament. There were no substitutes in those days. The 11 men who started would finish, whatever happened to their legs, their lungs, their luck. Among them was a young center forward from Fall River named Bert Patenaude, a factory worker with a striker's instinct, the kind of player who drifts unnoticed and then, in a single moment, decides everything. Standing beside him was Billy Gonsalves, a broad, powerful man often called the Babe Ruth of American soccer. Picture them lining up on the grass in heavy wool shirts, the fabric already dark with sweat, boots stiff as wood. They looked less like modern athletes and more like the men you would pass on any factory floor. Which, of course, is exactly what they were. For years, a strange story followed this team, and it is worth setting gently to rest. People said the Americans had cheated, that they had filled their side with imported British professionals, ringers smuggled in to win. It was repeated so often it became accepted as fact. But when historians finally looked closely, the myth dissolved. Yes, 6 of the men had been born in Britain, but 4 had come to America as boys, and between all of them, their professional experience back in Britain added up to just 2 games, both in a lower English division, years before. They were not hired guns. They were immigrants who had grown into the game on American fields. The truth was quieter and better. This team was strong, not because it borrowed greatness from elsewhere, but because for one brief era, America was quietly growing its own. When the tournament began, the Americans surprised everyone, perhaps most of all the men they were playing. Their first match was against Belgium, and the young U.S. side won it 3-0. One of their forwards, Bart McGee, struck a goal so early in World Cup history that people still argue, gently, over whether it was the very first goal ever scored in the competition. Think of that, a player from New York, in a borrowed moment on a field in Montevideo, standing at the edge of something that would grow into the biggest sporting event on earth. He almost certainly did not feel the weight of it. He was just trying to score. That is how history usually happens, not with trumpets, but with an ordinary man doing an ordinary thing, unaware that the ground beneath him is turning into legend. 4 days later, they did it again. Against Paraguay, the Americans won by the same score, 3-0, and this time the story belonged entirely to Bert Patenaude. He scored once, then twice, then a third time, 3 goals in a single match by one man. It was the first hat-trick in the history of the World Cup. And here is the strange, tender part. For decades, the records were muddled, and one of his goals was credited to a teammate, so Patenaude's achievement quietly slipped out of the books. He lived his whole life and died without full recognition. It was only in 2006, more than 70 years later, that FIFA looked again at the old accounts and finally gave the first World Cup hat-trick back to his name. A quiet correction, arriving long after the man who earned it had gone. History, it turns out, sometimes remembers slowly. With 2 clean wins, the United States had done something no one expected. They had reached the semi-finals of the very first World Cup. Let that settle for a moment. A team of mill workers and factory hands, sailing in from a country that barely followed the sport, now stood among the last 4 teams in the world. Back home, hardly anyone noticed. There was no live broadcast, no crowd gathered around a screen. The news traveled slowly, by wire and by newspaper, if it traveled at all. The men themselves were far from everything familiar, in a summer that was winter in the southern hemisphere, the air cool, the fields firm. They had climbed higher than any American soccer team ever would for the next 72 years, and most of their countrymen were simply going about their evenings unaware. Then came the wall. In the semi-final, the Americans met Argentina, and the afternoon turned hard. Early on, the U.S. goalkeeper twisted his ankle, and with no substitutes allowed, he played the remaining 80 minutes barely able to move, guarding his goal on one good leg. Then a defender went down with a serious injury, and the team played much of the match a man short, tired, hurting, outnumbered. Argentina scored, and scored again, and the final result was 6-1. On paper, it looks like a heavy defeat, but sit with what it actually was. A wounded team, thousands of miles from home, refusing to leave the field, playing on through pain, because leaving was not something you did. Even near the end, one of their players, James Brown, pushed forward and scored, a small act of defiance in a lost cause. There is a kind of quiet honor in that goal that no scoreline can erase. And so their journey ended, not with a trophy, but with something that has lasted longer. Because there was no match played for third place that year, the final standings were settled by counting goals, and the United States was placed third in the world. Third. It remains, to this day, the best result the American men have ever achieved at a World Cup, and the best any team from outside Europe or South America has ever managed. The men gathered their things, boarded a ship, and sailed home to their factories and their Saturday leagues, back to lives that would swallow them again into ordinary work. Most of them would never be famous. Some would be nearly forgotten. But the ball they had carried to the bottom of the world kept its faint warmth and kept, very slowly, rolling. As their ship turned north, the whistle of that first tournament faded behind them into the evening, the way the sound of a game fades when the players finally go home. They left behind a question that would hang over American soccer for decades. If this was the beginning, so bright and so unlikely, then why did the light go out? Why would it be 20 years before this country stunned the world again, and 60 before it truly came back? To understand the long silence that followed, we have to stay a little longer in these early years, in the small fields and factory towns where the game was quietly loved, and just as quietly let go. Part 2. The Forgotten Roots. The ship had brought them home, and home is where the story now stays for a while, because to understand the long silence ahead, we have to understand the world these men returned to. In the years right after that first World Cup, American soccer did not fade because the players were poor or because the country hated the game. It faded, in part, because the people who ran it fell to quarreling. There had been a bitter dispute, a kind of civil war within the sport, between the professional league and the national federation, each pulling the game in its own direction. And then, as if the timing needed to be crueler, the Great Depression arrived. Factories slowed, grandstands emptied, the very mill towns that had filled those Saturday crowds now had workers worrying about rent and bread. A game needs leisure to grow, and leisure was the first thing the hard years took away. The ball did not stop rolling, but the fields it rolled across grew quieter. Still, the country tried again. In 1934, the World Cup was held in Italy, and the United States sent a team to qualify, though the road there was strange. Their qualifying match was played in Rome itself, just days before the tournament against Mexico. And here the story gives us one of its most unusual men. His name was Aldo Donelli, an Italian-American from the coal country of Pennsylvania, and in that single match against Mexico, he scored all 4 of his team's goals. 4 goals by one man to carry the United States into the World Cup. Imagine the quiet satisfaction of that afternoon. A son of Italian immigrants scoring his way into the tournament on Italian soil, in the city his family's blood came from. He could not have known his moment in the sun was about to be very short. But for one afternoon in Rome, Aldo Donelli was the whole of American soccer, and he was magnificent. Then came the reckoning. In those days, the World Cup had no group stage, no second chances. You lost, and you went home. The United States, having just arrived, was drawn against the host nation, Italy, one of the finest teams in the world, roared on by a home crowd and, some would later say, by more than a little political pressure to win. The match was played, and it was hard. Italy scored 7. The United States scored 1, and the man who scored it, fittingly, was Aldo Donelli, the same Donelli, refusing to leave without leaving his mark. Then the whistle blew, and it was over. The Americans had crossed an ocean to play a single game, 90 minutes, and now they would cross it again to go home. There is something almost dreamlike in that, sailing for weeks for the sake of one afternoon. But that was the shape of the world then, when distance was measured in days at sea. And what became of Donelli, this man who scored all his country's goals and then vanished from the sport? Here the story turns gently sideways, the way real lives do. He set down his soccer boots and picked up a different game entirely. Aldo Donelli became a coach of American football, the other kind, the one with helmets and pads, and a good one. He would coach college teams and even, briefly, a professional franchise. The greatest soccer scorer his country had produced in that era simply walked into another sport and disappeared into it. It tells you everything about where the game stood in America. There was no path, no league waiting to catch a talent like his. A man could be the best in the country and still have nowhere to go. So he went somewhere else, and soccer led him. 4 years later, when the World Cup came around again in 1938, the United States did not even take the field. The team withdrew. There was no dramatic reason, no grand story, just the quiet arithmetic of a country that could not quite justify the journey. And so, for the first time since it all began, America was simply absent from the world's game. It is a strange thing to picture, a nation stepping back from the field and pulling the door softly closed behind it, not knowing that door would stay shut for the better part of a lifetime. The men who had sailed to Uruguay were growing older now. The bright beginning of 1930 was already becoming a memory, a story told by fewer and fewer people on fewer and fewer evenings. But here is the thing about a game that has been truly loved. It does not vanish, it hides. And in America, it hid in the places most people were not looking, in the neighborhoods of immigrants and the tight-knit streets of certain cities where the game had always meant home. Nowhere was this truer than in St. Louis, a river city in the middle of the country, far from any coast, where soccer took a deep and stubborn root. In St. Louis, the game was passed down in Catholic parishes and on parish fields, from fathers to sons, played in the dust of the neighborhoods by boys who had never heard the word exotic applied to a ball and 2 goals. While the rest of the country forgot, St. Louis quietly remembered. It kept the flame in a lantern, out of the wind, and one day, that lantern would matter more than anyone could have guessed. Think of what soccer meant in those neighborhoods. For families who had crossed an ocean to reach America, the game was a thread back to the old country, a language that needed no translation. In the Irish streets, the Italian streets, the German and Scottish streets, a ball and a lot after supper was a small piece of somewhere they had left behind. The children who grew up in those places did not learn soccer as a national sport. They learned it as a family sport, the way you learn a grandmother's recipe or an old song. There is a particular tenderness in that, a game kept alive not by stadiums or money, but by belonging. And so while the headlines forgot soccer entirely, in 1,000 kitchens and backyards it was still, quietly, being loved. It even had its monuments, small and easy to miss. Back in the mill town of Fall River, Massachusetts, there had been a proper soccer ground called Marks Stadium, built in the early 1920s, a real home for the game with real crowds. For a time it stood as one of the few purpose-built soccer venues the country had, a little cathedral of the sport in a New England factory town. In the decades of silence that followed, Places like it grew faded and fell quiet, the grass a little longer each year. But the ball, our ball, had rolled across grounds like that one. It remembered the feel of a field that had been built for it and loved for it. And in the long wait ahead, that memory was a kind of promise. Somewhere, someday, the crowds would come back. By now, the game in America had settled into something small and patient. No World Cups, no headlines, just the amateur leagues, the church teams, the immigrant clubs, the boys in the vacant lots. It would have been easy for an outsider to look at all this and decide that soccer in America was simply dead. But dead is the wrong word. Dormant is closer. A seed in winter looks like nothing at all, a dry, hard speck in cold ground, and yet everything it will ever be is folded up inside it, waiting for warmth. American soccer, in these forgotten years, was that seed, small, overlooked, alive. And the men who tended it, the parish coaches and the immigrant fathers, were keeping something safe without ever knowing what it would become. So the ball rested through the long middle years in a country that had turned its face elsewhere. Far off, the whistle of that first great tournament had long since faded into the dusk, and no new whistle had risen to replace it. But rest is not the same as ending. Somewhere in St. Louis, a boy was learning to trap a ball on his instep in a dusty lot. Somewhere, a hearse driver was growing up, who did not yet know he would one day guard a goal against the finest team in the world. The pieces of the next miracle were already scattered across the country, in ordinary lives, waiting to be gathered. And gathered they would be, on one impossible afternoon in Brazil, when a handful of American amateurs would walk onto a field against the kings of the game and change what was possible. Part 3. The Miracle on Grass. 20 years had passed since that first bright journey, and the world had turned through a great darkness in between. A world war had come and gone. When the World Cup finally returned in 1950, held in Brazil under a warm southern sun, the United States decided, almost quietly, to send a team again. But this was not a squad of seasoned professionals honed by years of play together. This was a gathering of ordinary men, pulled from their jobs and their cities, stitched into a team almost at the last moment. They had trained together, really trained together, exactly once. Picture that for a moment. A team about to walk onto the world stage, and they had shared the field as a full group a single time. No one expected anything of them, least of all perhaps themselves. And yet the ball, our ball, was about to roll into the most astonishing afternoon in all of American soccer. To understand who these men were, you have to set aside every image of a modern athlete. Their goalkeeper, Frank Borghi, drove a hearse for his uncle's funeral home in St. Louis, a former minor league baseball catcher with quick, sure hands. Their midfielder, Walter Barr, was a school teacher in Philadelphia. Among the others were mailmen, a man who worked in a mill, a dishwasher. These were not men who trained under floodlights. These were men who finished a day's work and then went to play the game they loved in the evening light. When the coach, newly appointed and painfully honest, was asked about their chances, he did not offer brave words. He told the press his players were, in his words, sheep ready to be slaughtered. He believed it. Almost everyone did. And still, they packed their bags for Brazil. Many of the American players came from St. Louis, that quiet river city that had kept the game alive all through the forgotten years. 5 of the men who would start the most famous match hailed from those same Catholic neighborhoods where soccer had been passed down like a family heirloom. Do you feel the shape of the story turning here? The lantern that St. Louis had guarded through the dark decades, out of the wind, was about to be carried onto the world stage, The boys from the dusty parish lots had grown into men, and now they were assembling in a foreign country to represent a nation that had largely forgotten they existed. There is something almost tender in it. The people who never stopped loving the game were about to be the ones who made it shine. Their opponent, on the afternoon that mattered, was England. And England, in 1950, was not merely good. England were the kings of football, the nation that had given the game to the world, entering their very first World Cup with a swagger earned over decades. Their players were full professionals, famous names, drawn from the great clubs of the English leagues. The bookmakers gave England strong odds to win the whole tournament. They gave the United States odds of 500 to 1. So certain were the English of an easy win that they rested their brightest star, Stanley Matthews, widely thought the finest player alive, deciding to save him for tougher tests ahead. It was not arrogance exactly. It was simply what everyone assumed. A school teacher and a hearse driver were not supposed to trouble the kings of football. Everyone knew that. Everyone was about to be wrong. The match was played on the 29th of June in a mining town called Belo Horizonte, on a modest field ringed by hills. From the very first minute, it went exactly as expected. England attacked and attacked and attacked. Within the opening 12 minutes, they had half a dozen clear chances, 2 of which struck the woodwork and bounced clear. Wave after wave rolled toward the American goal, and there, again and again, stood Frank Borghi, the hearse driver, throwing himself across his line, tipping shots away, catching what could be caught. He said later that at the start he was simply hoping to hold England to 5 or 6 goals. Hold them to 5 or 6. That was the ambition, to lose respectably. And yet, minute by minute, the ball would not go in. The Kings kept knocking, and the door, impossibly, kept holding. Then, near the end of the first half, came the moment that would echo for the rest of the century. Walter Barr, the school teacher, gathered the ball out near the middle of the field and sent it toward goal, a hopeful ball, more across than a shot, drifting in from 25 yards. The English goalkeeper shifted to gather it, an easy claim. But rising to meet that ball came Joe Gaetjens, a Haitian-born forward who, only weeks earlier, had been washing dishes in a Brooklyn restaurant while studying accounting. He flung himself headlong, horizontal in the air, and grazed the ball with his head, just enough to send it spinning away from the keeper's reach and into the corner of the net. The goalkeeper's own momentum carried him the wrong way, and the ball settled in the goal, 1-0. The United States, against every law of probability, were ahead of the kings of football. The second half was a siege. England, stunned and now desperate, threw everything forward, certain the natural order would reassert itself. They had to score. They were England. But the Americans, lifted by that single impossible goal, grew braver rather than smaller. And behind them all, Borghi kept his goal, save after save, his hands sure, his nerve holding. The minutes drained away, and when the final whistle finally blew across that field in the hills, the score had not changed, 1-0. The no-hopers had beaten the kings of football. The Brazilian crowd, who had come to watch and had fallen in love with the impossible, poured onto the field and lifted the American players onto their shoulders, carrying Gaetjens aloft like a hero. This dishwasher, this accounting student, borne through the warm evening air on the shoulders of strangers. And then, the strangest part of all, back in England, when the score came clicking in over the news wires, editors simply did not believe it. The United States won. England, nothing. It made no sense. Some assumed a digit had been dropped in transmission, that surely the real score was 10-1, or 10-0, in England's favor, and a few papers, so the legend goes, printed it that way. History has since gently corrected even this, showing the tale is partly myth. But the fact that people believed it, that a whole nation found it easier to imagine a typing error than an American victory, tells you exactly how impossible this thing was. It was so far outside the expected shape of the world that reality itself seemed like a misprint. In America, meanwhile, almost no one knew. Only a single American journalist had made the trip to Brazil at all, a man named Dent McSkimming from a St. Louis newspaper, and he had come only because he paid his own way when his paper refused to send him. He used his vacation time and his own money to witness the greatest result in his country's soccer history. Later, he tried to explain to Americans just how strange it was, and he found the perfect words. It was, he said, as if Oxford University had sent a baseball team over and beaten the New York Yankees. That was the scale of it, and it had happened in near silence, unseen by the country it belonged to, carried home by one man who had cared enough to buy his own ticket. A miracle, witnessed almost alone. What came after is quieter and sadder and worth holding gently. Both teams were soon eliminated, and the men sailed home to their ordinary lives, to the funeral home and the classroom and the mill. For decades, the victory was nearly forgotten in America, spoken of by almost no one, until the game's slow return in the 1990s finally brought it back into the light. And Joe Gaetjens, the man who scored the goal, went home to Haiti, where years later he vanished under a brutal regime, taken away, never to return, his fate a shadow over so bright a memory. The ball rolled on, as it always does. But it carried now the warmth of that one afternoon in the hills, when a hearse driver and a school teacher and a dishwasher stood against the kings of the game, and, for 90 unforgettable minutes, would not be beaten. And then, once more, the long quiet closed in. Part 4. The Wilderness Years. After Belo Horizonte, the door closed again, and this time it stayed closed for a very long while. The United States would not appear at another World Cup for 40 years. 40 years. A child born the summer of that famous victory would be middle-aged before the American team walked onto that stage again. Tournament after tournament came and went, and the qualifying rounds ended, almost always, the same way, in defeat and quiet elimination, the scores sometimes lopsided, the results barely noticed at home. It is a strange thing to sit with, an entire nation absent from the world's game for 4 decades, while the rest of the planet gathered every 4 years to watch. The ball did not stop rolling, but for a long time now, it rolled in the shadows, far from any stage, in a country that had turned its attention elsewhere. And where did the country's attention go? To other games. This was the age when American football and baseball and basketball grew into giants, filling the stadiums and the newspapers and the long, lazy afternoons. Soccer, in the ordinary American imagination, became something foreign, a game they had heard was popular somewhere else. There is a gentle irony in it, because the country had once, briefly, been very good indeed. But greatness that no one remembers is a fragile thing. The men who had sailed to Uruguay, the men who had beaten England, grew old in near anonymity, their deeds folded away in yellowing archives. If you had asked an average American in those years whether their country had ever done anything at a World Cup, most would not have known there was anything to remember. The lantern still burned, but it burned in very few windows. Then, in the late 1960s, something stirred. A new professional league was born, the North American Soccer League, an ambitious attempt to plant the game in American soil once and for all. At first it struggled, teams folding, crowds thin, the whole enterprise wobbling like a newborn calf. But there were dreamers behind it, men with money and vision who believed that if you could only show Americans the beautiful game played beautifully, they would fall in love. And to do that, they reached for the most audacious idea imaginable. If Americans would not come to soccer, then soccer's greatest figure would come to America. They set their sights on the finest player the world had ever seen. They set their sights on Pelé. In 1975, it happened. Pelé, the king of the sport, the man who had won 3 World Cups with Brazil, signed with a team called the New York Cosmos. Try to feel the strangeness and the wonder of it. The greatest soccer player alive, in the twilight of his career, choosing to spend it not in Rio or Madrid or Milan, but in New York, to help a country learn to love his game. Suddenly there were crowds, real crowds, tens of thousands of them, pouring into the stands to see this magician with the ball at his feet. For a few glittering seasons, soccer in America was glamorous. The Cosmos drew stars from around the world, and their matches became events, alive with color and noise and the particular electricity that follows genius wherever it goes. For a moment, it seemed the long wait might finally be over. But glamour and foundations are not the same thing. The Cosmos shone brilliantly, and other teams spent wildly trying to keep up, importing aging foreign stars at enormous cost, chasing the crowds. Underneath the bright surface, though, the league was not built to last. It was spending far more than it earned, leaning on spectacle rather than roots. When Pelé finally hung up his boots, and the novelty began to fade, the crowds thinned again. Teams ran out of money. One by one, the lights in those stadiums went dark, and in 1984, after years of slow decline, the North American Soccer League simply folded and disappeared. The great experiment was over. Once more, the country was left without a top professional league, without a stage, the beautiful dream packed away like decorations after a holiday. It would be easy to see only the sadness in that collapse, the wasted money, the empty stadiums. But something had happened during those bright years that no bankruptcy could undo. A whole generation of American children had seen the game played. They had watched Pelé and the stars who came after, and something had lodged in them. And so, all across the country, in the suburbs especially, children began to play. Not in professional leagues, but in something humbler and, as it turned out, far more powerful, the youth soccer field. On Saturday mornings, in parks and on school fields, the orange slices came out at halftime, and the parents lined the sidelines in folding chairs, and millions of small legs chased a ball across the dewy grass. The professional game had crumbled, but the roots unseen were spreading wider than they ever had before. The numbers, when you sit with them, are quietly astonishing. By the early 1990s, it was estimated that some 18 million Americans played soccer at one level or another, most of them children. 18 million. A country that supposedly did not care about soccer had, without much fanfare, become one of the largest soccer-playing nations on earth, at least among the young. But there was a catch, and it was a painful one. All those children playing, all those millions of small dreams, and no professional league at the top to grow into. The pyramid had a broad and thriving base and nothing at the peak. A talented young player could rise, and then reach the edge of a cliff, with nowhere left to climb. The game was everywhere, and it led nowhere. It was, perhaps, the strangest chapter of all. A nation full of players, and no place for them to become heroes. Think of what that meant for one of those children, lacing up small boots in the cool of a Saturday morning. They loved the game with the pure, uncomplicated love that only children have for the things they play. They had heroes, though most of those heroes played in leagues an ocean away, glimpsed only rarely on a flickering television. They dreamed, as children do, of great stadiums and roaring crowds. But somewhere in the back of it all lay the quiet truth that in their own country, that dream had no home. And yet they played anyway, because the game itself was enough. Because chasing a ball across the grass on a bright morning needs no promise of glory to be worth doing. In that pure and undemanding love, the future of American soccer was being quietly grown, one Saturday at a time. For soccer had always survived best in America, not through money or fame, but through belonging, through the immigrant neighborhoods, and now through these ordinary suburban families. It had gone from being the game of the mill towns to being the game of the minivan, carried in the trunk with the folding chairs and the water bottles, played on fields mowed by the local parks department. There was nothing glamorous about it now. No Pelé, no floodlights, no crowds of tens of thousands. Just children and grass and the soft repeated thud of a ball being kicked, over and over, in the gentle boredom of a weekend afternoon. And that, it would turn out, was exactly the soil the game needed. Not the hothouse of imported stars, but the patient, ordinary ground of children who simply liked to play. So the wilderness years drew toward their close, quieter than they had begun. The great league was gone, its stadiums dark, its stars dispersed. But the country was now full, absolutely full, of young people who knew how to trap a ball and pass it and run. All they lacked was a reason to believe it could lead somewhere. And far off, faintly, that reason was coming. For the game's great rulers had begun to look at America with new eyes, seeing not a country that had failed at soccer, but a vast and hungry market waiting to be won. Change was on its way, in the shape of a single goal in a far-off qualifier, and then in the shape of the whole world arriving on American shores. The whistle that had faded so long ago was, at last, about to be answered, and the ball, patient as ever, was ready to roll back into the light. Part 5. The Return. The change, when it finally came, arrived not with a roar, but with a single kick of a ball, on a hot afternoon in the Caribbean. It was late in 1989, and the United States stood on the edge of something it had not touched in almost 40 years. One match remained in their qualifying campaign, played away in Trinidad, and the situation was brutally simple. Win, and they would go to the World Cup for the first time since 1950. Anything less, and the long exile would continue. The home crowd had come dressed in red, certain their team would send the Americans home, so certain that the day already felt like a celebration. The Americans walked out into that heat and that noise carrying 4 decades of absence on their shoulders, and the ball, our patient ball, was about to roll into a moment that soccer would remember by a single phrase. The man at the heart of it was named Paul Caligiuri, and he was not a household name, not even in his own country. But in the 30th minute of that match, he received the ball out near the left, looked up, and struck it. It was not a simple shot. It dipped and curled from distance, a long, arcing effort that seemed to hang in the air a moment too long, and then dropped beneath the crossbar and into the goal, 1-0. The red-clad crowd fell silent, and that goal, that single strike in a small stadium far from home, became known ever after as the shot heard round the world. With it, the United States held on to win, and 40 years of waiting ended in an instant. The exile was over. America was going back to the World Cup. It is worth pausing on what that goal truly meant beyond the scoreline. For an entire generation of American soccer people, this was the moment the door reopened. All those children on the suburban fields, all those years of playing that seemed to lead nowhere, suddenly had somewhere to point. Their country was among the best in the world again, or at least among those invited to the table. Caligiuri had not just scored a goal, he had, with one swing of his leg, connected the forgotten past to a future that was only beginning to take shape. Somewhere, a boy watching on television saw that ball dip into the net and understood, perhaps for the first time, that this was possible for an American. The whistle that had faded so long ago, back in Uruguay, had finally been answered by a whistle that meant welcome back. There was another reason the timing mattered so much, humming quietly in the background. The year before, in 1988, the game's rulers had made a momentous decision. They had chosen the United States to host the World Cup, the whole tournament, in 1994. Think of the strangeness of that. A country that had not qualified for the event in decades had been handed the honor of staging it. There were many who thought it made no sense at all, who wondered how you could bring the world's greatest football festival to a nation that barely followed the sport. But the rulers of the game saw something else. They saw a vast country, full of stadiums and full of young players, the last great untried market in the world. And so American soccer suddenly had two reasons to hope: a team returning to the field, and the whole world coming to visit in just a few short years. And so in the summer of 1990, the United States took its place at the World Cup in Italy, back on the great stage after a lifetime away. But returning and thriving are not the same thing, and the men who traveled to Italy were, in truth, still learning what this level demanded. Many were recent college players, young and raw, facing opponents who had grown up inside the professional game. Their first match, against Czechoslovakia, was a hard welcome back to the world. They lost, and lost heavily, by 5-1. It was a sobering afternoon. The gap between hope and readiness laid bare on the grass. The single American goal that day came, fittingly, from the penalty spot, struck by a young player named Paul Caligiuri, the same man whose distant goal had brought them there. Even in defeat, he left his signature on the story. Their second match asked even more of them, for it placed them against the host nation, Italy, in Rome, in front of a vast and passionate home crowd. This was the same city, strangely enough, where the United States had been thrashed by Italy more than half a century before, back in 1934. History has a way of folding back on itself like that. But this time, something was different. The young Americans, expected to be swept aside, dug in. They defended with a stubbornness few had thought they possessed. And though Italy scored, the Americans held them to a single goal, 1-0, a scoreline that felt, in its own quiet way, like a small victory. They had stood before one of the finest teams in the world, on that team's own soil, and refused to be humiliated. The result was a loss. The performance was a promise. The tournament ended for them soon after, with a third defeat to Austria, and the Americans went home having lost all 3 of their matches. On paper, it was a failure. 3 games, 3 losses, out at the first hurdle. But numbers rarely tell the whole truth of a thing. This young, inexperienced team had simply shown up, had crossed the ocean and taken their place among the nations after 40 years away, and had learned, in 90-minute lessons, exactly how far they still had to travel. You cannot skip the difficult middle of any long journey. These men were walking it. And every hard afternoon in Italy was quietly preparing the ground for what would come when the world arrived on American soil, now only 4 years away. For that was the thought that carried them home and carried the whole country's small soccer community forward through the early 1990s. The World Cup was coming. Not to Italy, not to some distant land glimpsed on television, but here, to American cities, American stadiums, American summer afternoons. It was a prospect at once thrilling and faintly terrifying. Would anyone come? Would Americans, who ranked soccer somewhere below the most obscure pastimes, actually fill these enormous stadiums to watch a game they barely knew? No one could say for certain. The organizers worried about it in quiet rooms. But the decision was made, the honor was granted, and there was no turning back now. The ball had rolled back into the light in Italy. Soon it would roll into the very heart of America. And in those 4 years of waiting, something began to shift in the country itself, slowly, almost imperceptibly. Newspapers that had never covered soccer began, tentatively, to explain it. The children who had grown up on the suburban fields were teenagers now, and some of them very good. The idea of soccer, long treated as foreign, began to feel a little less strange, a little more like something that might, after all, belong here. The seed that had been planted in all those youth leagues was pushing, at last, toward the surface. It needed only sunlight now, only a great and public occasion to draw it fully into bloom. And that occasion was almost upon them, gathering on the horizon like the warmth before a summer dawn. So the team that had returned from the wilderness went quietly back to work, and the country began, half nervously, to prepare for the whole world to come knocking. The long silence was truly over now. Ahead lay the summer that would change everything, the summer of record crowds and unlikely converts, of a tournament that even its doubters would come to call a triumph, and of the quiet birth of a league that would finally give all those children somewhere to grow. The ball had waited a very long time for this. Now, at last, it was ready to roll onto the biggest stage of all, at home, under an American sky. Part 6. America Hosts. And then the summer came. In 1994, for the first time in its history, the United States threw open its doors and welcomed the entire world to play the beautiful game on American soil. It is hard, now, to recapture how uncertain it all felt beforehand. This was a country where, in a survey taken around that time, soccer ranked 67th among the nation's favorite sports, somewhere below, of all things, tractor pulling. The organizers lay awake over a single question that seemed almost too simple to be so frightening. Would anyone come? They had these vast stadiums to fill, built for other games, and a public that mostly shrugged at soccer. No one knew if the seats would hold crowds or echoes, and into that uncertainty, quietly, the ball rolled onto the grandest stage it had ever known. The answer arrived on the very first day, and it silenced every doubt. The opening match was held in Chicago, at Soldier Field, on a scorching afternoon, and the stadium was packed to the brim. More than 60,000 people crammed shoulder to shoulder in the heat. Among them sat the President of the United States himself, and beside the famous faces sat ordinary Americans who had come, many of them out of simple curiosity. The noise they made rolled around that old stadium like thunder. From that first day to the last, it was the same story, in city after city. The stadiums filled, and they did not just fill, they overflowed, with tourists and die-hard fans and, most tellingly, with complete newcomers who had never watched a match in their lives and simply wanted to see what all the fuss might be. When the tournament finally ended, the numbers were staggering, and they still stand today. More than 3.5 million people attended the matches of the 1994 World Cup, the largest total attendance in the history of the event, a record that has never been broken, not in any tournament since. On average, nearly 69,000 people came to each game. Let that settle for a moment. The country that had ranked soccer below tractor pulling had just staged the best-attended World Cup the world had ever seen. The doubters had been answered, not with argument, but with the simple, overwhelming fact of all those bodies in all those seats, all that noise pouring out into all those American summer evenings. The seed planted long ago in the youth fields had drawn, at last, an enormous and curious crowd. The American team, too, gave the home crowd something to hold on to. They had drawn their opening match, and then came the game that would define their summer, against Colombia, one of the tournament's fancied sides, played before more than 90,000 people at the Rose Bowl in California. On that vast stage, the United States won, 2-1. It was their first World Cup victory since the miracle against England, 44 years before. Think of the length of that wait. Nearly half a century between wins, closed at last on home soil, before the largest crowd many of those players would ever see. The result carried them out of the group stage and into the knockout rounds, the first time an American team had gone so far since that very first tournament, all the way back in 1930. The circle, in its own quiet way, was closing. But that match against Colombia carries a shadow within it, and it must be told gently, because it belongs to the human heart of this story. One of the goals in the American victory came when a Colombian defender, stretching to cut out a cross, turned the ball into his own net by mistake. His name was Andrés Escobar. It was the kind of unlucky moment that happens in football all the time, a small misfortune in a single game. But these things landed differently in the world he came from, and not long after returning home, Andrés Escobar lost his life in an act of senseless violence, over a game, over a goal that was never meant to be scored. It is a sorrow that sits quietly beside the joy of that summer, a reminder that this is only a game, and that the people who play it are human and precious, and ought always to be treated so. We hold his memory here with tenderness, and let it rest. The American run ended soon after, in the round of 16, and it ended against the finest possible opponent. They were drawn against Brazil, the most decorated soccer nation on earth, the eventual champions of that very tournament. The Americans defended bravely, as they had learned to do, and held the great Brazilians to a single goal, 1-0. They lost, and their summer was over, but there was no shame in it, only the quiet dignity of a young team that had stood before the masters and made them work for every inch. And then the players walked off, and the tournament rolled on toward its conclusion without them, and the crowds that had come to cheer them turned to simply enjoying the spectacle of the world's best. But something had been kindled that would not go out. For the 1994 World Cup had come with a promise attached, a condition set by the game's rulers when they granted the tournament in the first place. America had to build a professional league, a real one, a permanent home for the sport at the highest level. For all those years, this had been the missing piece, the broad base of youth players with no summit to climb toward. And now, at last, the summit would be built. 2 years after that record-breaking summer, in 1996, a new league kicked off, called Major League Soccer. It began modestly, just 10 teams, its future far from certain. But it was there. For the first time in over a decade, the country had a top professional stage of its own. The children on the suburban fields finally had somewhere their dreams could lead. The story of what that league became belongs to later parts of our journey, but it is worth glimpsing the road ahead from here. Those first 10 teams would, over the coming decades, grow into 30. Purpose-built soccer stadiums, almost unknown in America before, would begin to rise, the first of them opening a few years later, a modern echo of that little ground in Fall River from so long ago. Great players from around the world would eventually come, drawn by the growing crowds, just as Pelé had once come to New York. But all of that lay in the future. In the mid-1990s, it was simply a beginning, small and hopeful, a single green shoot pushing up through ground that had been cleared, at last, by the great and unexpected triumph of that summer. And so 1994 stands as the true turning point in this long story, the moment the whole trajectory bent upward. Everything before it had been either the bright early promise or the long forgetting. Everything after it would be, in one way or another, the slow and patient work of growth. The country had discovered, almost to its own surprise, that it could love this game, that it could fill great stadiums for it, that the foreign thing had been quietly becoming native all along. The whistle that had faded in Uruguay so many years before had, at last, found its answer, not just in one goal or one match, but in 3.5 million people gathering under the summer sky to watch the world play. The ball rolled on from that summer changed, and so did the country around it. There would be difficult days ahead, low tournaments and painful lessons, for growth is never a straight line. But the direction was set now, unmistakable and true. From here, the story becomes one of a soccer nation slowly, unevenly, coming into its own, learning to compete, producing players the world would come to know by name. And it would rise, 4 years later, only to stumble badly, before climbing higher than it had in 70 years. But that is the next stretch of the road, waiting quietly in the warm dark ahead. For now, let the record crowds fade softly into memory, and let the ball come to rest, just for a moment, in the long grass of a summer that changed everything. Part 7. The Unexpected Summit. Growth, as anyone who has ever tended a garden knows, is rarely a smooth climb. It comes in fits and setbacks, a rush of green followed by a hard frost. And so, 4 years after the triumph of hosting, the American team traveled to France for the 1998 World Cup, carrying real hope, and there they endured one of the hardest tournaments in their history. They lost all 3 of their matches. They scored only a single goal in the entire competition. And when the final standings were counted, the United States sat dead last, 32nd out of 32 teams, at the very bottom of the world. After all the promise of 1994, it was a bitter, humbling fall. The ball, which had rolled so triumphantly onto the home stage, now rolled quietly off a French field into the deepest disappointment the modern team had known. It would have been easy, in the gray light of that failure, to wonder whether 1994 had been a mirage after all, a summer of crowds that meant nothing lasting. But endings and beginnings often stand closer together than they seem. In truth, beneath the surface, the country was changing. The young professional league was finding its feet. A new generation of players was rising, boys who had grown up not in a soccer wilderness, but in a country that now had a World Cup and a league of its own, who had watched the crowds of 1994 with their own young eyes. Among them was a small, quick attacker from California named Landon Donovan, and a thoughtful, elegant midfielder named Claudio Reyna, and a brave forward named Brian McBride. They were not yet famous, but they were coming, and they would carry the team to a height no one saw approaching. That height arrived in 2002 at a World Cup held far away in Korea and Japan, and it began with a shock that echoed the old miracles. In their opening match, the United States faced Portugal, a team gilded with world-class talent, expected to brush the Americans aside. Instead, the young U.S. side raced out to a stunning lead, scoring 3 goals in the first half, and held on to win, 3-2. It was the kind of result that made people across the world sit up and ask when, exactly, the United States had become a team that could do this. The answer was that it had been happening all along, quietly, in the youth fields and the young league, growing where few were watching. Now, on a field in Asia, in the small hours of an American morning, that quiet growth stepped suddenly into the light. The group stage carried them onward, unevenly but far enough. They drew with the host nation, South Korea, and though they lost their final group match to Poland, results elsewhere broke in their favor, and the United States advanced into the knockout rounds. And there, waiting for them, was the opponent that mattered most of all, the one that stirred something deeper than any other. They would face Mexico, their great neighbor and their oldest rival, the team against whom every match carried the weight of pride and history and a shared, contested border. To meet Mexico in the knockout stage of a World Cup, with everything on the line, was the kind of fixture that could define a generation. The whole American soccer world held its breath, and the ball rolled toward one of the most cherished afternoons in the country's soccer memory. The match itself became legend. The United States played with poise and courage, and they won it. 2-0, a scoreline that American fans would come to speak of almost like a sacred phrase. 2-0, 2-0. Brian McBride scored, and then the young Landon Donovan, and the great rival was beaten on the biggest stage there is. For a country still learning to believe in itself at this game, it was a moment of pure arrival. This was not a lucky upset, not a miracle snatched from the jaws of a thrashing. This was an American team simply being better than a very good opponent on the day it mattered most. The victory carried them into the quarterfinals of the World Cup, the last 8 teams on Earth, a place no American side had reached since that very first tournament, 72 long years before, back when the ball had first crossed the ocean by ship. In the quarterfinal, they met Germany, one of the towering nations of the sport. And here the story tightens into something almost painful in its nearness. The Americans did not shrink. They played Germany close, matched them, pressed them, and at one moment came agonizingly near to a goal that might have changed everything, a ball that struck a German defender's arm on the goal line, in a way that, to American eyes then and forever after, looked as though it should have been punished. But no whistle came. The chance passed. Germany held on to win by a single goal, 1-0, and the American summer was over. They had come within a whisker of the semifinals of the world. They lost, but they lost like a real football nation, unlucky rather than outclassed, and everyone who watched understood that something fundamental had shifted. For this was the true meaning of 2002, deeper than any single result. The quarterfinal run was, and remains, the best the modern American team has ever achieved, the high water mark of everything the long years had been building toward. All of it, the forgotten roots, the wilderness, the return, the record-breaking summer, the humbling in France, all of it had been leading, though no one could have charted the path, to this. A young team, mostly homegrown, standing among the last 8 teams on the planet, and looking entirely as though it belonged there. The children of the suburban fields had grown up and gone to the edge of the world stage, and though they did not reach the summit, they had climbed higher than anyone in living memory had dared to imagine an American team could climb. The players came home not as unknowns this time, but as figures a whole country was beginning to recognize. Landon Donovan, especially, stepped out of that tournament as the face of a rising nation, a young man carrying the hopes of a game that was, at last, taking real root in American soil. He would go on to become the most important player his country had yet produced, appearing at World Cup after World Cup, his name woven through the next decade of this story. The league at home was growing steadier now, the crowds a little larger each year, the pathway from the youth field to the professional game finally, genuinely open. The cliff that talented young players had once reached, with nowhere left to climb, was slowly being built into a staircase. And the ball rolled on, carrying more weight now, more meaning, more belief than it had held in 70 years. And so the American team settled into a new and unfamiliar place in the world. No longer the curiosity, no longer the no-hopers, but a nation that could, on its day, trouble anyone. There would be more World Cups ahead, more heroes, more heartbreak of the ordinary kind that all football nations come to know. There would be a goal in the dying seconds of a match that would make a whole country leap from its seats as one, and a goalkeeper who would have the greatest single game of his life on the biggest stage. But those belong to the next stretch of the road. For now, the summit of 2002 stands quietly in the story, the highest point the modern game had reached, a young team on a far-off field, so very close to the top of the world. The whistle that failed to blow in that quarterfinal, the one that never came, faded into the warm dark like all the whistles before it. Another sound folded into the long day of American soccer, and the game went home to grow some more. Let it rest there a while, at the top of its unexpected climb, before the road carries us gently onward into the modern era, into the years of Dempsey and Donovan, and one unforgettable goal in South Africa, when a nation would hold its breath in the final seconds, and then, all at once, exhale in joy. Part 8. The Modern Team. The years that followed the great climb of 2002 were quieter, and a little harder, the way the years after a peak so often are. The World Cup came again in 2006, held in Germany, and for the Americans it was a difficult summer. They found themselves in a punishing group, and they could not find their way out of it. There was a single bright thread in the disappointment, a goal scored against a strong Italian side by a young forward from the American South named Clint Dempsey, a player with a quiet toughness about him, the kind of man who never seemed to know when he was beaten. That goal was the only one the United States managed in the whole tournament. They went home early, their summer brief, but Dempsey's name is one to remember, for he would carry the team's spirit through much of the decade to come. 4 years on, the World Cup traveled to South Africa, and the summer of 2010 gave American soccer one of the sweetest moments in all its long story. It came in the final match of the group stage against Algeria, and the situation was cruelly simple. The United States had to win. A draw would send them home, and for 90 long minutes, the goal would not come. They pressed and pressed, and the ball would not go in, and the clock ran down toward heartbreak. The whole thing seemed destined to end in the quiet ache of what might have been. And then, deep into stoppage time, in the very last breaths of the match, it happened. The move was sudden, a swift American break upfield. A shot was saved, the ball spilled loose across the face of goal. And there, arriving at exactly the right instant, was Landon Donovan, the same Donovan who had risen to fame in 2002, now a seasoned figure, carrying his country's hopes once more. He swept the loose ball into the net, and a whole nation, watching in offices and bars and living rooms, erupted as one. Grown men leapt into the air, strangers embraced. The relief and the joy of it poured out across the entire country in a single, spontaneous roar. It was the last-second goal that every child dreams of scoring, and Donovan had scored it, on the World Cup stage to send his country through. Of all the moments in this long story, few are remembered with such pure, uncomplicated happiness. That goal won the group, and it meant something beyond the joy of the moment. Winning the group, rather than merely scraping through, was itself a marker of how far the team had come. Earlier in that same tournament, they had drawn with England, their old rivals from the miracle of 1950, meeting them again on the World Cup stage 60 years after that impossible afternoon in Belo Horizonte. History, as it does, had folded gently back on itself. The Americans were no longer the no-hoppers of that ancient story. They were a team England had to respect, a team that had earned its place. The ball that had been carried across an ocean by ship so long ago was still rolling, and it rolled now among the established nations of the game, unremarkable there, which was its own kind of triumph. Their run in South Africa ended in the round that followed, against Ghana, in a match that slipped away in extra time, a quiet disappointment after so much joy. But the memory that summer left behind was not the ending. It was Donovan's goal, that last gasp strike, the sound of a whole country crying out at once. Sometimes a single moment matters more than the final result, lodging in the memory long after the scoreline has faded. For millions of young Americans, that goal was the moment soccer became theirs, the moment they understood how much a game could make you feel. The seed planted in the youth fields had grown into something that could stop a nation in its tracks and make it leap for joy. That is no small thing for a game once ranked below tractor pulling. Then came 2014, and the World Cup in Brazil, and a summer that belonged, above all, to a goalkeeper. His name was Tim Howard, a steady, bearded man who had guarded the American goal for years. The United States had fought their way out of a fearsome group, helped by a late winner from a young defender named John Brooks against Ghana, a goal that arrived like an answer to a prayer. And so they reached the knockout round, where they met Belgium, a team stacked with brilliant players. What followed was a siege, and at the heart of it stood Tim Howard, alone. Wave after wave of Belgian attacks broke against him, and again he turned them away. He dived, he stretched, he blocked with his hands and his feet and his body, keeping his team alive long past the point where they might have folded. By the end of the night, he had made 15 saves, the most that anyone had recorded in a single World Cup match in the entire history of the tournament. 15. Across the country, people who barely knew the game watched in wonder as one man held back the tide almost by himself. The United States lost the match at last, in extra time, by 2-1. But Howard's performance became legend, a display of courage and skill so complete that it outshone the defeat. Sometimes a team goes home, and yet a single player's night lives on. For that is the quiet truth these modern years taught, over and over. The American team did not win a World Cup in this era, did not reach another semifinal, did not climb again to the heights of 2002. What it did instead was become permanent. It became a team that showed up, that competed, that produced moments a whole nation could gather around, a goal in the last second, a goalkeeper's impossible night. The heroes now had names people knew, Dempsey and Donovan and Howard, names spoken in ordinary conversation, in a country that had once forgotten it ever played this game at all. The game had woven itself into the fabric of American life, one tournament, one moment, one hero at a time. And the ball rolled gently on through those years, carrying its accumulated warmth, its long memory of ships and miracles and record crowds and last-second goals. It had been rolling now for the better part of a century, across oceans and decades and generations of players who had each held it for a while and then passed it on. The story it carried was almost whole, but not quite, for ahead lay one more hard lesson, a night of failure that would wound the country deeply, and then, out of that wound, a fresh and hopeful beginning. The road was turning toward its final stretch, toward heartbreak and rebirth, and then toward the summer, when the whole world would come home to America once more. So let the modern team rest here, in the warm middle distance of the story, with Donovan's roar still echoing and Howard's hands still reaching. The whistle of those summers fades, as all the whistles do, into the gathering quiet, and the ball waits, patient as ever, to roll on into the years just before our own, into a Caribbean night that would break a nation's heart, and the young players who would, in time, gently mend it. Part 9. Heartbreak and Rebirth. Blind. There are nights in the life of every football nation that leave a mark that does not fully fade, and for the United States, one such night came in the autumn of 2017. The team had reached the final stretch of qualifying for the 2018 World Cup, and the arithmetic, as it so often was, seemed forgiving. They needed only a modest result in their last match, away in Trinidad, to be sure of their place. After every World Cup since 1990, after almost 30 years of showing up, of belonging, it seemed unthinkable that they might not go. And so the country half watched, expecting the routine to hold. But football does not deal in certainties, and that warm Caribbean night had a different ending in mind. The match went wrong from early on, in the small, unlucky ways that matches sometimes do. A deflected shot looped strangely into the American goal. Then another went in, and the United States, needing only a little, suddenly found themselves needing far more and unable to find it. Elsewhere, other results broke against them, each one tightening the noose. When the final whistle blew in Trinidad, it was over. The United States had failed to qualify for the World Cup for the first time since 1986, the first time in more than 3 decades. For a generation of American fans who had never known a summer without their team, it was a genuine grief, quiet and disbelieving. The ball, which had rolled through every tournament for so long, would sit out the next one entirely. It is worth sitting for a moment with what that failure truly meant, because grief, handled gently, can teach what triumph cannot. For years, American soccer had assumed a kind of steady forward motion, as though growth, once begun, would simply continue on its own. That night in Trinidad ended the illusion. It reminded everyone that nothing at this level is owed, that a nation must earn its place again and again, that the staircase built out of the old cliff could still be stumbled upon. There was pain in that lesson, real pain. But there was also, folded within it, a strange kind of gift. For a country that had grown a little complacent was forced to look honestly at itself, to tear down what was not working, and to place its faith, of necessity, in the young. And the young, as it turned out, were extraordinary. Even in the darkness of that missed tournament, a new generation was rising, more talented, perhaps, than any the country had produced before. At its heart was a slight, quick attacker named Christian Pulisic, a young man who had left home as a teenager to test himself in the great leagues of Europe, and who was thriving there against the best in the world. Around him gathered others, young Americans playing at major European clubs, no longer curiosities abroad, but genuine talents earning their place. It was as though the long, patient work of all those decades, the youth fields, the league, the growing crowds, had finally produced a crop of players the world would have to take seriously. The heartbreak of Trinidad had cleared the ground, and in that cleared ground, something fresh and hopeful was already growing. So the team went to work rebuilding, and 4 years later, they came again to the great stage, at the 2022 World Cup in Qatar. This was a young side, one of the youngest in the whole tournament, carrying the scars of the failure that had shaped them and the promise of the talent that had risen since. They were drawn into a demanding group, and among their opponents, in a twist the story seemed almost to arrange on purpose, was England, the old rival once more. 72 years after the miracle of Belo Horizonte, the two nations met yet again on the World Cup stage, their threads still crossing after all this time. The young Americans held the mighty England to a goalless draw, standing toe-to-toe with them, unafraid. History had folded back once more, and the Americans had earned their share of it. The tournament turned, in the end, on their final group match against Iran, with everything on the line. Win, and they would go through to the knockout rounds. Anything less, and they would go home. It was the kind of night that gathers a whole country to its screens, hearts and throats. And it was the young captain himself, Christian Pulisic, who settled it, throwing his body toward the ball to force it home, and taking a heavy knock in the very act of scoring, giving something of himself for the goal. The United States won, 1-0, and passed into the knockout stage, back among the last 16 teams in the world. From the ashes of Trinidad in just 4 years, the young team had risen and returned. The rebirth was real. Their run ended in the round of 16, against a strong and experienced side from the Netherlands, who were simply sharper on the day and won by 3-1. The young Americans went home, but they went home changed, and so did the country's sense of them. This was not the end of something, the way 2018 had felt like an ending. This was, everyone understood, a beginning. These players were young. Most of them would still be in their prime when the next World Cup came around. And the next World Cup, as it happened, would be unlike any the team had ever known, for it would be played at home, on American soil, before American crowds. The heartbreak had passed, the rebuilding had borne fruit, and the greatest stage of all was now rushing toward them. For this young generation carried a weight and a gift that no American team before them had quite carried. They knew that when the world came to America, they would be the ones to walk out and represent the whole long story, all of it, the ship to Uruguay and the miracle in Brazil, and the record summer of 1994, and the roar of Donovan's goal. Every player who had ever pulled on the shirt, every parish coach in Old St. Louis, every child on a dewy suburban field, all of it would be standing behind them as they took the field at home. It is a great deal to carry, but there is also a deep grace in it, in being the ones chosen by time to be present when the world comes home. The ball that had rolled for nearly a century was about to be placed at their feet, on the grandest occasion their country had ever staged. And so the story arrives, at last, near its own doorstep, in the years just before our own. The wound of Trinidad had healed into something stronger. The young players had crossed the ocean, proven themselves against the best, and come home carrying real belief. The long, uneven climb of American soccer, across all its decades of forgetting and remembering, had brought it here, to the edge of the largest World Cup ever held, on its own soil, with a generation ready to meet the moment. The whistle of Qatar faded softly into the dark. Another sound folded into the century-long day of this game in America. And the ball came to rest for just a moment, gathering itself before the final and greatest stretch of its journey. For ahead now lay the summer. The whole story had been quietly moving toward all along. Not a distant tournament glimpsed on television, not even a single nation's triumph, but the world itself arriving on American shores, alongside its neighbors to the north and south, in the biggest festival the game had ever known. 16 cities, dozens of nations, and an American team, young and unafraid, ready to carry 100 years of history onto the field. The road had one last turning left, and it turned gently toward home. Part 10, The World Comes Home, 19. And so we arrive, at last, at the doorstep of the present, in the summer of 2026, when the whole world came home to America. Not to one country alone this time, but to three. For this World Cup was shared, spread across the United States and its two great neighbors, Canada to the north and Mexico to the south, the three nations of a single continent opening their doors together. It was the largest World Cup ever held, grown now to 48 teams, more nations than had ever gathered before, playing across 16 host cities that stretched from the Pacific coast to the Atlantic, from the cool north down into the warm south. Think of the size of it. A tournament so vast it needed a whole continent to hold it. And at the heart of it, once more, stood America, no longer the doubtful host of 1994, but a country that had, over 30 long years, quietly grown ready. How different it was, this second time, from the first. In 1994, the organizers had lain awake, wondering whether anyone would come, whether the seats would fill, whether a nation that ranked soccer below tractor pulling could be trusted with the world's game. By 2026, those worries belonged to another age entirely. Now there was a professional league grown from 10 teams to 30, with stadiums built for soccer alone, purpose-made homes for the game that would have seemed like fantasy back in the wilderness years. Now there were crowds who knew the sport, who had grown up with it, who spoke its language fluently. The seed that had been planted in all those youth fields, tended through all those forgotten decades, had grown at last into something sturdy and deep-rooted and unmistakably alive. The country had become, quietly and against all the old expectations, a soccer nation. The 16 cities lit up, one after another, across that great continent. In the vast stadiums of Los Angeles and New York, of Dallas and Atlanta and Seattle, the flags of dozens of nations rose together, and the sounds of the world's many languages mingled in the summer air. Fans traveled from every corner of the earth to be there, filling the stands, filling the streets, turning American cities into a festival of the whole human family gathered around a single game. And for the United States, there was a deep and quiet meaning in playing host once more. The country that had once forgotten it, ever loved this game, was now the place where the world chose to celebrate it. The circle that had opened on a ship bound for Uruguay almost 100 years before was closing here, on home soil, beneath a summer sky. For the American team, to walk out onto that home stage was to carry the whole long story on their shoulders. Every part of it we have followed tonight. Behind those young players stood the mill workers who sailed to the first World Cup in 1930. Behind them stood the hearse driver and the school teacher who beat the kings of football in 1950. Behind them stood the 40 years of silence, and Caligiuri's distant goal that ended it, and the record crowds of 1994, and Donovan's roar, and Howard's impossible night, and the heartbreak of Trinidad, and the young generation who rose from it. All of it, the whole century, was present in the shirt they wore. Whatever happened on the field, and a story this gentle need not dwell on the scores, the deeper truth was simply that they were there, at home, chosen by time to stand at the center of the game when the world came calling. And that, in the end, is the quiet triumph this long story has been building toward all along. Not a trophy, the United States has never lifted the World Cup. And this tale has never been about that. It has been about something slower and in its own way, more tender. The story of how a game can be loved and forgotten and loved again. How a seed can lie dormant through a long winter and lose nothing of what it will become. How the patient work of ordinary people, parish coaches and immigrant fathers and parents in folding chairs on the sidelines of 1,000 Saturday mornings can grow across generations into something that fills great stadiums and gathers a whole world. American soccer never took the shortest path. It wandered and stumbled and waited, but it arrived. Think, one last time, of that old leather ball we have followed through all these years. It began on the deck of a ship in 1930, tossed between laughing young men, crossing an ocean toward a game their country would soon forget. It rolled through mill towns and immigrant streets, through the dust of St. Louis, through the long silent decades when almost no one was watching. It rolled onto the field in Belo Horizonte, and off it again into near total silence. It waded through the wilderness years in the boredom of suburban fields, kicked back and forth by children who did not know they were keeping a flame alive. And then it rolled back into the light, into record crowds and last-second goals, all the way here, to a summer when the whole world came to watch. The same ball, the same slow, patient roll, carrying 100 years of warmth. It has stopped now, that ball, resting in the grass at the center of it all, at the place where the whole long journey was always quietly heading. It does not need to roll any further tonight. It has crossed its ocean and come home. And somewhere out beyond the stadium lights, as the great festival winds down and the crowds drift softly away into the warm night, a referee lifts a whistle to his lips for the last time and blows, and the sound rises into the dark and slowly, slowly fades, the way it faded on that first evening in Uruguay so very long ago, the last sound of the longest day of play. The game is over, the world is going home, and the long story rests. There is a place for you in it too, though you may never have thought so. For this was never only a story about famous players and distant tournaments. It was a story about a game that belongs in the end to everyone who has ever loved it, or watched it, or kicked a ball across a patch of grass in the fading light of an ordinary evening. You are part of that long story now, simply by having followed it here to its quiet close. The names will drift away by morning, and that is exactly as it should be. What remains is only the gentle shape of it, a ball rolling patiently across 100 years, and coming, at last, to rest. So let it rest, and let yourself rest with it. There is nothing left to remember, nothing left to do. The ship has long since docked. The crowds have gone home. The whistle has faded into the dark. All across the sleeping continent, the great stadiums stand quiet under the stars, their lights dimming one by one. And somewhere, on a still and darkened field, an old leather ball lies motionless in the cool grass, holding the last of its warmth, waiting for a morning that is in no hurry to come. Sleep now. The long day of play is done. We have come a long way tonight, you and I, following one old ball across almost 100 years. From a ship bound for Uruguay to a miracle in the hills of Brazil, through the long quiet and the slow return, all the way home to a summer when the whole world gathered on American shores. It was never a story about winning. It was a story about loving a thing and losing it and finding it again, patiently, over generations. There is no need to hold on to any of it. Let the names go. Let the scores go. Let the whole long journey settle somewhere soft, the way the day settles into evening, without your having to do a thing. If stories like this one keep you company on quiet nights, then rest easy knowing there will always be another waiting, whenever you would like to drift along again. But that is for another time, not now. For now, the ball has come to rest in the cool grass. The last whistle has faded into the dark, and you are exactly where you are meant to be, warm and still and gently letting go. You are part of this long story too, and the long story, tonight, is finally at rest. Sleep well, sleep deep. The game will keep until morning.